and the audience for enriching the conversation with your questions. Our next session today, our next panel, is titled Words Reclaiming the Language of Indian Food. This is especially interesting to me because I also work with words and around food. Hosting this panel, it's Tanushree who's hosting this panel, and I'd like to invite her on stage. Tanushree is a development professional, food historian, and writer, as also the co-founder of ICA. She has contributed to the Bloomsbury Handbook of Indian Cuisine, presented at the prestigious Oxford Food Symposium in 2022, and frequently writes for newspapers. Her research interests include ancient and medieval Indian food and mythology, and she uses her research to craft curated culinary experiences via folk tales. When not researching, Tanushree works for the World Bank.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here on a Sunday morning. As Priyadarshini said at the beginning, we had nothing better to do, and for us, we couldn't get away from it. But all of you being here makes us feel like, okay, maybe this is a good thing to do. So thank you for being here. I have a very daunting task right now, not the panel, but sitting next to the ladies whom I'm going to sit to. So before I, go on to a more, to read out about their work, may I please invite on stage Archana Nathan, Dr. Ishita De, and Sharanya Deepak, our panelists for today morning. Thank you so much for being here. Just to put, into perspective what we are going to talk about, I'm going to pick on, I think, one of the most commonly used terms in Indian food, or when we are talking about Indian food outside. In fact, even when we are talking amongst ourselves now, and I'm talking of the curry, right? I think all of us here have read about it. We use it, and we use it to describe a lot of things. And quite a few of us here have also written about it and frequently use that term in our writing. But strangely, I think there are very few of us who actually eat a curry at home, We eat dal sar, we eat undhiyo, we eat kormas, we eat khaliyas, we eat ghanto, we eat jhol and jhal. And yet a lot of times when you write about it, we kind of subsume all of it under that term. And I think there was a reason we did it when we started doing it, but I think today one of the reasons why we are all here is to say that are these terms a little past their expiry age, and is it time to reclaim the language that we write about Indian food in? So as I said, we couldn't think of better people, to talk about it here with us. And the way I would describe them is in their professions, they're in professions which are kind of gatekeepers of how we use languages to interact with you. I have to read out their bios because I really don't want to be wrong. Okay. Archana Nathan is the senior commissioning editor of Penguin Random House India. Archana has been a journalist, writer, researcher, and a podcaster. Dr. Ishita De is the assistant professor at the Department of Sociology, Faculty of Social Sciences, South Asia University in Delhi. Ishita also is one of those rare academics in India who teach food as a part of a formal education system, and please do look up on her research on the labor in the sweet industry in Bengal, and she's done some really stellar work on food in India. Sharanya Deepak, writer and editor. I'm a big fan of your work, Sharanya, and I think a lot of us here are. I heard a lot of excited voices when we said that you are on the panel. She has won the Queen Mary Wasafir New Writing Prize and fellowships at One World Media and South Asia Speaks. Sharanya is currently working on a book of essays, and we all look forward to it. As I said, we are going to talk about the language of Indian food, and curry was one of the ways of putting it into perspective. What I find very interesting is, let me first say how we are going to go about it. I will just introduce two questions to you to begin the discussion, one after the other, and I'll uh, let you respond to it from your unique perspectives and vantage points in your professions. And at the end of all of your comments for that round of question, if you want to respond to each other's comments, we will also take that, because I think that's going to enrich the discussion. And then we'll follow it up with another question, and then we will open it up to the audience. We want to keep it fairly conversational and informal, and I think the most is going to come out of that. So let's begin. Thank you. So as we said, I think especially in our urban imagination of Indian food writing, the language is English. And I often feel there are two reasons for it. One is because it is kind of necessity driven, because in a country of more than, a few thousands of languages and dialects, English has landed on our lap as the common language of interaction. It also allows us to take the food outside to the outside world, and there's no getting away from it, and I don't think we are even thinking of getting away from it completely. I think that's not the idea that we are prosecuting. But the second thing also is, I think it's kind of implicit in our minds that in a country which also is extremely disparate in terms of how we eat food and our access to food and nutrition, that a lot of writing is meant for the class and community which has access to good food and nutrition, and that is an English speaking class and community, right? So what it does also is that it includes a certain kind of people, it excludes certain kinds of people. What I'm trying to drive is that language has that power of broadening the interaction that the world and communities can have with food, but it can also be reductive and reduce how we are talking about food, especially the nuances of it. In the context of English as a language of writing about Indian food, and I'm going to first come to you, Sharanya and Archana, that Sharanya, you write about Indian food, and much of your writing is extremely nuanced, right? About when you try to bring that nuancing into Indian food. How difficult or challenging it is, or have you seen it improve, about translating or writing about a food which is not rooted in the language that you're writing about? How do you negotiate that space? And from there to you, Archana, as an editor, do you see more acceptability? Are we also dumbing down our readers who might, be willing to accept more, about Indian food terms, learn more about Indian food by still writing in languages which kind of is, is just constricting it? The cases, one of the cases in point, as I said, is a curry.
I'll start. Hi, thanks for having me. And I think before I answer anything, I want to introduce the way I write, or the way that the magazine I edit works, because I don't actually consider myself a food writer. I feel like I write about cities and urbanism and migration and things like that, and food is a part of it. I don't really know very much about food, which helps therefore, I guess it comes off as nuanced, but it's also because I'm literally know nothing, so I'm asking a bunch of questions. But sorry, and I just want to say that the magazine I edit also is based between India and the UK, and I'm based here and my colleagues are there. And we always say that Vittles, it's called Vittles, and we say that if you take the food out of it, it would still be Vittles, but if we take the kind of long-form reporting and research kind of focus that we do, then it wouldn't be. So again, I feel like food for me is a lens into something, and it's never about the dish itself. And maybe this comes from the fact that I grew up in a family where language itself was not puritanical, as my father's family is Tamil-speaking immigrants from Rawalpindi, which is kind of a bit nuts, but and then to Delhi. So we never had this kind of one cuisine, one language family. So, and I'm a very, very kind of shahri person, as we say. I don't really have that many roots and things. I grew up eating on the street, I grew up eating in dhabas, I didn't grow up eating at home because both my parents were working. So I think for me, maybe for everybody else, there are certain terms and kind of there is a certain sacredness to your homebound recipes. For me, there's not, because we were only eating like cheese toast and stuff. Cheese toast is only called cheese toast, you know, you can't actually call it something else. So that said, like for your, I think for the curry question, I'm going to say, I don't know, I guess it's a controversial thing, but I don't really mind, because I feel like it addresses the idea that this was a food that was appropriated, sold, and like made kind of sellable. And at the moment, it's more of an industry than it is like a dish. So I guess when I lived in Europe, there was kind of like curry mayo, curry chicken, you know, things like that. So it's kind of a genre, much like we do Szechuan in India, which is like not got anything to do with Sichuan, but it is very much, for me, it's a prominent genre of food. Like I crave it. But what does that mean? Because if a Chinese person saw it, they'd be like, no, that's not real. So I think that language, like food, has a way of mutating and moving. And personally, I'm not concerned with holding it to standards of origin at all. Maybe because I don't have any myself. But, and the same with the magazine, I think that we also kind of, again, like it's not kind of like, can you say curry or can you not say curry, but also like how it's used. So if it's used, I guess, to demonize and patronize people, then of course it's like, you know, that is the effect of it. But if it's used, I think, for example, I think in South Africa, there is a kind of puri patha or something they call it, which is kind of like two puris and one like crispy thing that they fry and they sell as like a burger in some fast food joints. And that they have a thing called curry mayo. And there I think it's quite useful because it kind of signals the fact that there's a South Asian community involved. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I feel like I've veered away from your question entirely. But actually, I would like to talk about the editing more than the writing. And when time's up, just tell me so I can pass.
I think we have some time, so
Okay, yeah. So I think basically what I made some notes, and what we tried to do at Vittles is, because the stories I edited about 3,000 words in the end, and like 6,500 words or something to start with. So, and again, they're oftentimes about something else. They're not about food. So, for example, right now I'm working on a piece about dam engineering systems in Pakistan with a writer from Sindh, and how that kind of led to fish scarcity. Or like another kind of Vittles piece, a very Vittles piece would be like something I wrote actually, which is about the tandoori momo, which is like one of my staples, much to everyone else's kind of like perplexion. But you know, and just the idea of like migrations and how temperament makes dishes. Like Delhi likes to put everything in a tandoor, and therefore we did this thing, and we were like, it's great, you know. So that kind of thing. So, but especially when we're working on pieces like this, I feel like the language, again, like you said, of the final thing is so far away from what people are experiencing. So for Zohaib's piece, for the Pakistani writer who's working on this Sindh dam engineering piece, he's talked to a lot of people on the Indus Delta who are speaking Sindhi, but I guess also speaking a specific dialect. And he's a vernacular, I don't like this word, but that's how he says it. He's a vernacular reporter. So he would kind of do oral histories rather than do documentation. And he wanted to write in English, even though we offered him that he writes in Sindhi and we translate it. So, you know, again, I don't want to be patronizing and say, nahi, tum Sindhi mein likho, and then we'll do this. That's also not my job. So we kind of ended up in this like middle ground with like half Sindhi, half English, which was kind of mad. But then we couldn't publish it like this because the readership is mostly British. So I had a really hard time trying to figure out what to do. Because like as bilingual people, I think when we see bilingual things, it's kind of like natural, but English people get really like, they're just like, what's going on? You know, like they're almost kind of affronted by 2 or 3 languages existing. So we had to figure this out. So the way I kind of sometimes address this as an editor is keep quotes in both languages, or do kind of like just snippets of people's quotes, or he wanted to put poetry in that's originally in Sindhi, so we keep the Sindhi and the English. And like for the piece I wrote about tandoori momo in Delhi, all the quotes were kind of just really Delhi, and there was lots of curses and whatever. There's no way to translate what people are talking about on the street in Lajpat Nagar to like English. So again, like I kept all that in Hindi. So that is something, but you know, I don't think it's enough. And sometimes I think about how we can do this and how people have to kind of change their linguistic systems to write for a publication like the one I did. But then, because we have 3 rounds of edits and things like that, even if I let it be, someone at the end will come and say, this doesn't make sense. But then again, I think that like naturally bilingual societies have a propensity for reading bilingually, and like my English colleagues also, for example, don't not always understanding. And this, as a writer, I guess I've struggled with a lot as well. Like, I was writing a piece about housing in Delhi and street vendors. And the idea that essentially everyone demands sanitation when they eat street food, but like street vendors are migrants that live in really harsh conditions and don't have clean water and things like that. But then always the condition is ki 10 rupees ke liye you want like splendid clean food, but that's just not how it works unless you give people shelter. But then it was this really puzzling thing because my main source was this really, really kind of razor sharp, really fun man from Bihar, and I was hanging out with him, Pankaj, and he said something, because he said like, all I want is to do my job, which is sell kulche chole, but also I want to sleep with my, basically he said, मुझे अपने भाइयों के साथ और अपने परिवार के साथ एक घर में रहना है. Is that so much to ask? And he said something like, ख्वाब और परिवार सिर्फ अमीरों के होते हैं क्या, or something like, is family and dreams only for rich people? And when I translated literally and I sent it to my editor, who is American, and when the draft came back, it said, I am poor, can I not have dreams, or something like that. And I was like, that's not what he said. That's not his personality. So it's this kind of like eclipsing of people's language into completely changing their personality, especially when it's working class people, then you make them sound, like they're always demanding something, or asking for something, when he's like riffing, like he talks very quickly and he's just really sharp. So I had to really pull what mattered. And this kind of thing happens a lot, and I've struggled with it, I think, as a writer. So, yeah.
We're going to hold on to that thought of working class people in food and come back to Ishita for it. But yes.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for having me here. And I do want to add to what Sharanya just said. But before that, I think to respond to the bit about curry, and I know in what context you're bringing it as a sort of a reductive term, and we've moved on from it, and I'm happy to report that we have moved on from it, at least in terms of the kind of literature we're seeing. I'm not saying that it's not happening. It is happening. I still get irritated when idli is called a rice cake or a dumpling or some such thing, but I feel like we've moved on, and that's a good thing to accept and cherish and sort of build on. At the same time, I feel like we're no longer in a situation where Indian food, and first of all, what is Indian food, right? It's difficult to sort of put all of that into one broad category. Like an Indian restaurant doesn't make sense at all. It's so many different things, the subcontinent really. But we've reached a situation where world over there is now enough of a familiarity with the kinds of food that are coming or that are being sort of prepared in the subcontinent. So we should, when we're writing about it, I believe that we should build on the fact that the reader knows, and we needn't assume that the reader or the listener will not make that effort if they don't know. Because I understand that certain audiences abroad, like Sharanya was saying, that they get like baffled, but it's okay to unsettle them also, is my opinion, because it's like you do the work, because we're willing to do that kind of work, say when it comes to fiction. Say if there's like fiction coming out of Nigeria, and there's a way in which they use in English language. We're willing to sort of sit with that rhythm. We're willing to sit with the words. So why not with food that's coming out of, say, Indian English, which is evolving constantly, and there are different versions of Indian English across the subcontinent. So I feel like, it's always good for me to keep in mind who's the audience that anyone is writing for. And both with English writing about food, both in India and abroad, they both need to, the readers both should be doing the work as well. And meaning is sort of created together when you're reading, right? The writer has written, but you're reading it and you're creating meaning together. So that work needs to go in, and we don't need to assume that they don't know or they won't know. Having said that, of course, we should have already moved on beyond cake and dumpling and words like crepes. My God, yes. Every time, yeah. But having said that, I come from Bangalore and I'm in Delhi, and I still hear stuff that about, say, Kannada cuisine or Tamil cuisine, which I just can't believe that, say, Delhi is saying these things about it. So I understand that there is, but we're not going to get anywhere if we perpetuate these words anyway. Uh, Having said that, there are limitations, of course. There are some words that are just not translatable, and it needn't be translated. Why, in search of like brevity of expression, we try to sort of stick to existing words like cake and dumpling, or like we need like a one-liner about a certain dish. We don't need a one-liner, and I thankfully work not in journalism anymore, so I have a book-length luxury of space in terms of describing something, a chapter-length luxury of space. So why not take that many words to describe what is being eaten or prepared? Take that many words, let the person who's reading it soak in and sort of imagine what that's like. There are pictures also to assist, but I feel like we don't need to stick to that one liner that's in brackets that doesn't have to absolutely capture a certain food ingredient or a dish. So I feel like there is use the word. I would say we should be using words that are not translatable. It's okay to use unsettled, throw them off, not lull them into reading the same thing, but at the same time, uh, when necessary, just there is obviously, I'm not saying that while writing in English you should absolutely, like, it should not be filled with. I'm not saying that you can't translate everything, so you would just use all the regional items, but there needs to be some sort of work that's going on to sort of write about Indian food in English, but it's in a way that keeps in mind who the audience might be, but at the same time represents it accurately. So for me, there are limitations, but there are solutions as well. And it's high time we move on from whatever was happening until now. Of course, there was a context to why certain words were used in thanks to our colonial past. But I think we can move on 2024, and I feel like there's enough and more knowledge about Indian food now. So yeah.
So Ishita, coming to you, and I think both Sharanya and Archana has actually paved the way for me to ask you two particular things. One is, of course, when Sharanya mentioned about the working class, street vendors, a lot of your primary research is with that. And you're talking to them in a language that you're not often writing in. How do you negotiate that space, right? Because the work that you do often is a reference material for writers who are, doing maybe full-length books or doing features. So how do you negotiate that space of the language that you're researching in, you're interacting in, and translating it into your work without losing it? Because I think, especially in an academic piece, it's so important to not lose the essence of, your respondent in the spirit, the personality in which it has been said. Once that. Second, because Archana mentioned that we are poised to move on. You teach. A lot of the new voices, writers are going to, you're training them. Where do you see that, in the classrooms? What kind of, what are the discussions that we are having there?
Thank you. These are very, very important questions. I think I come from the discipline of sociology and anthropology. And I think very early on, when the discipline was introduced in India, I think there was a necessity to move out of the area studies model. And I think this is where engaging with the language, learning the language, and the cultural language and cultural translation really, really becomes important. So I'm going to speak from, rooted in that discipline. And I say this because one of the challenges that we often have during our field work, and we are extremely cautious, particularly when we are working with working class, or when we are working with participants not from our class caste background, is not to call it participatory research, because there is a power relationship involved. And I think it is very important to recognize, acknowledge that power relationship, even while we are placing quotations. This is one thing that I have been trained in, and this is one thing I think I like to pass on to my students. first recognizing your own caste, class, gender politics as a writer is extremely important for negotiating with cultural translations, right? And that without that recognition, I feel that at times the politics of food writing falls flat, right? It doesn't matter if it's a fine dining restaurant or because scholars have worked on fine dining restaurant, but the most nuanced class analysis actually has come out from there, right? Scholars have worked on working class food, but there is no class analysis there. So choosing the right kind of topics also doesn't help until and unless that recognition and that negotiation is constantly going back and forth. One of the, of course, learning the language is one bit, and learning the language of the field is another bit. I can tell you from my fieldwork, at least in the sweet shops of both West Bengal and Bangladesh, having known Bangla helped, but being a woman did not help in this familiar sweet shop. I never realized, as a consumer, sweet shop feels less gendered, when you go as a consumer, right? But as a researcher, and I mean, for the first time, and I understand this is all being recorded, but for the first time, I remember in 2010 when I entered the workspace of a sweet shop, I kind of realized in the first week that much of the production process that happens in the night of the sweet shop, I will not be able to observe because of my gender. Do I feel upset about it? Not necessarily so if I recognize the gender caste politics of mine, because the workers simply said that, listen, we want to be comfortable while we are working, right? They all wear cloths which they might not want to be, lifting up, doing while I am around. I also put on a facade of, every day going in a sari. 6 months into the fieldwork, they were like, you anyway sit, the way you wear jeans. So let's put up this facade. And 1 or 2 days, you come in the evening, but you understand, you're a middle class woman. If you, hover around in the night, in the sweet shop, we don't know, there are these young men. So a lot of gender questions were being addressed, right? But so, but also I think yesterday's conversation through our internet, do we have time for building these relationships, right? And I think building these relationships will allow us, because initially I started with my field notes in English, and later on I started writing in Bangla, my field diary. That really, really helped. Coming to the second question, I think politics of language has entered both undergraduate curriculum and postgraduate curriculum. And I think today's generation is slightly better placed about the nuances and politics of language compared to ours. And I take responsibility and I can defend what I mean by it. Many of them all come from a position where either they have been introduced to languages which are set by whatever educational curriculums they are coming from, so they were aware they might not know the language they are going to work with, people they are working with, and they take it for granted. So not knowing actually helps, what Sharanya was saying. So in my case, I thought I knew Bangla, but I did not know the Bangla of a certain kind, right? But when you start from a clean slate, and I think, but I would really, I mean, if I want to work on a certain, certain group, it is very important for me to know the workings of the language, because otherwise we are only referring to English sources. There, I think I have my reservations. I have my wholehearted reservations, because particularly in certain geographical contexts where there is a vibrant publishing industry in local languages, I think it's very, very important to cross-refer that material also for someone who doesn't understand Bangla. I would want to write about, Pronobre, Samran Huda, so that they know about, these authors alongside Utshare.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think it is my responsibility to also bring that in classroom teaching. So many a time I give a simple exercise, that how would you draw up a food syllabus? And mostly it would be English writings. And then I was like, but you know how to read Bangla. you know how to read Farsi, because that's a privilege of teaching in the South Asian University, where we also have students speaking other languages. I said, why can't you refer to one newspaper article which is published in a local language in your classroom settings? So that also gives our audience, respect, and I think a window to a world apart from publishing in English.
Thank you. And I think you just kind of made that opening for me to go into my second, question, because as you said, there is so much work in regional languages, and some of them have a very robust publishing system. And it's not new work that we have in regional languages. One of our, oldest published cookbooks were in regional languages. And when I'm talking of published cookbooks, because I think a lot of the old cookbooks that we say coming out of Indian subcontinents, and we say that they were written in English, were actually not about talking about Indian food. They were talking about, the colonial food systems. They were talking about, the British women who came here, their lifestyles, the food, and how they were negotiating that space. But about the Indian food, we have extremely, we have a very good system of cookbooks. We have very old cookbooks that have come out. And since you said that, let me start with you again, saying that, how do you then use that? Because also, most Indians, we speak more than one language, that's true, but that space is vast. There are too many languages out there, dialects, huge dialects, number of dialects. Is there a way, do we have a system where we can use these regional language work as reference in our English food writing? And here, I would especially like to know about the academic, semi-academic space of writing. How do we do that?
So I think, one of the ways, I think one of the I read Bangla and English. So from Bangla, I can think of a magazine called Robbar, which is published, on Sundays, and there are long form essays with proper references, and which means that, that the writer or the publisher kind of ended up deciding that, at least we would, if anyone wants to go back and read a little bit more, they can go back and read it, I think. And I think when we are researching on food, there are sources apart from cookbooks, right, and cookbooks, they're still digitalized, they're available online, all of that is there. But I think the more interesting material actually are this, say for instance, Sweet Meat Traders Association have a newsletter, right? Now, they were literally throwing it away, because there were no space in the sweet shop which used to be run. I got interested, I put it together, I passed it on to someone who runs a sort of a private, food archive, saying you keep it so that future generation of researchers can have access to it. Because where do I give this material? That's one thing. Also, when we give this material, this has to be properly, properly referenced so that for the future catalog researchers to kind of use, right? So not everything needs to be translated, like this is where, I kind of draw the line. If I have to read a Farsi reference, I put in some time there, or I get someone who is a Farsi scholar, I collaborate, and I can, of course, this thing. The second part, so, and this is where I think academic writing, despite all the criticism that is there about academic writing, offers that space through the form of footnotes, bibliography, and that constant paying attention to the footnotes and endnotes. And I think one of the best things that teachers of D School has taught me is that your work is just a footnote in somebody else's work. And I think which is the best learning to have, which means that you're not coming up with something, so radically different that it is going to change the world. However, you're a small piece in that larger puzzle, right? So moment we think of ourselves as equal, I will take, if there is a, and that is why I said, if there is a union, manifesto, where suddenly, the sweet meat workers were mentioned, for me it becomes a source, along with caste association newsletters, where something was being referenced. So, right, how do you also navigate from one source to the other, right? This was your questions, right? So, moment I think of, I'm like that small, bit in that long puzzle. I'm literally a footnote. So I will keep on looking for where other people have better scholarship and I am not doing something radical. I mean, I always believe that ways, and I think students really get upset when I say this, when many of the students are there, that, that we are just contributing to this vast body of knowledge, and how do we end up ensuring that the previous footnote, that if there is something already established there, we don't need to repeat that. Can we move a little bit forward, right? So in moving that footnote a little bit forward, there is also a responsibility of, I think, playing with language. Within the academic space, I can assure you, there's a lot of thought that is going on into how we use the word community, right? And how responsibly, we unpack the category community, particularly because food and community becomes very interlinked, right? And we take, so often one part of the teaching of the course on food is don't take the community as given, right? Don't take the community as given. And in that ways, tandoori momo can be part of a certain community, but it may be disowned by a certain community, right? And this is where I think, unpacking of some of the received words, particularly in our pedagogy, really, really becomes important to pushing those footnotes in conversation.
Thank you so much. When Ishita talks about this, one of the reasons I asked her this is when I was doing the paper for the Oxford Symposium, I hit a huge roadblock. A lot of my material were these little books of Kirtan and, the Sanskrit text which had no dates. And I'm like, how am I going to reference it? And I called, I said, please come to my rescue. I have no clue how to do it. And I'm sure more people, a lot of us have that problem. But I think I will also give you a little more credit. You're not a footnote. You know that in my day job I work on infrastructure, right? And we often say, listen, we can't move a column, we can move walls. So these are the columns that you can't move. You can build walls around it or move them. So I'll give you more credit than just being a footnote. Since we are talking about translations, and you both work as editors, differences of an online medium and a published thing. Firstly, do we see more translations happening from Indian work to, so like when you're talking, you're taking it to a UK audience or an American, do we see more interest? Do we see more translations happening from Indian work to the English language, which also keeps, I think, the spirit and the nuance of it alive, and educates it better? That's my first question. Second, the mediums that you work on, does that affect the translation? Can I start with you, Sharanya? Or Archana, would you like to respond first? Let's invert the order.
Yes. Do we see more translations happening? Not enough, especially in non-fiction from regional languages. It's not happening. First of all, I don't like regional languages, so I'm just going to say not enough translations are happening in non-fiction, to be honest. Which really, I agree with when you said that, not everything needs to be translated. But given that a large part of the subcontinent speaks to each other in English, it's really important also to ensure that a lot of the translation happens. And as part of the publishing industry, I feel like the onus is on editors to do more. We need to do more in terms of finding translators who are willing to put in the kind of work that takes the context and make sure that it is represented accurately in English. And that's not happening enough with nonfiction and food writing for sure. And also with translation and when you talk about a certain region and food, I wanted to also address the fact that I think food writing in English could go beyond just putting together recipes, because again, when you say, I will give you the cuisine of Lucknow, I want to know whose cuisine are you talking about? I want to know, are you going to talk to me about how one community's power influenced what the other community ate? And here I'm talking about caste, here I'm talking about religion as well. So these things have to be part of. I don't see how you can write about food without writing about all of this. And often we fall short of it because we want to quickly put together a representative book about a certain region. But there's so much more that you need to be saying while you're putting that out, because it's not accurate representation of that place. But if we are struggling to put the subcontinent's food in one names category, how are we bringing out books that are so I think the responsibility is a lot on editors to be able to find the writers who are willing to put the kind of work in research that you're willing to put, collaborators, like you said, that you're willing to work with people who are sitting together and sort of making sure that the context is accurately represented. So English language food writing needs to really expand both in terms of vocabulary as well as representation and themes. That's not happening enough, and there's definitely more scope. But having said that, I think it's never too late, so we must absolutely start.
I think I want to first talk about something Ishita said. I think this, like, also these words like community and, I guess, resistance and humility and things like that, that get transferred into English. Like, oftentimes I see, I don't know, this is kind of, I'll go back to what we were talking about, but I see that Indian food is, I'm thinking about the global food media now, and actually something that happens is they have this, like, keyword repository where, I'll have an editor from the US write to me being like, people want to read about family, humble food, chai, something. Like, they're just, and I'm like, yeah, but I mean, I don't know if I want to, how do I tie all this together? But I just think that the industry works a certain way, and there definitely is this kind of, like, rotating tendency. Now, I don't know if we can change all that, especially because all of this is centered in the US, which kind of premises on this circularity. But something I find is that what's happening with Indian food now is that English kind of eclipses a lot of context. And I was reading this piece, which is not, which is about Isma Chuktai's short story Lihaf, and, like, the English translation essentially eclipses a lot of kind of, like, caste connotations and things like that. It presents it as unilateral, as if, like, South Asians are one big organism. And I think that this happens a lot in food media as well. And there's a lot of, like, resistance will be used really flippantly, or, like I was telling Shubhra and Rahi yesterday, but I think, like, humble is used a lot, where it'll be like humble table of, like, 16 dishes, and it's like, that's, like, that's just, I understand that, like, there's a woman that's labored for this food and all of that, but it's just this idea of humility is something that I think is used really flippantly, for example, like, especially with South Asian food. And something else I notice is that Indian food will never be mentioned, Hindu-owned Indian food will not be mentioned as, like, being like, these are okay people or whatever, but, like, my Pakistani colleagues always have to face, and a lot of Indian Muslim writers right now, I think, have to kind of face headlines as, like, don't be scared, this is like, this is good food, this kind of, like, really awful tendency, instead of people thinking about where this fear comes, like, why does everything have to be framed this way? So I think that happens a lot, which kind of troubles me, and we don't do that at Whittles. Like, for example, like, I saw this Pitchfork article, which is a music magazine about Pakistani music, which is, like, in war-torn and something Karachi, young people get together, and it's like, it's just like people in their house making music, much like in the UK or the US. But there's just this kind of, like, tendency, I think, that eclipses context entirely. Yeah, so sorry, now I'm going to get back to the translation bit. But, I mean, because I'm not an academic, but I'm a long-form writer, and, like, Whittle's pieces are also long, we do have the luxury of working on something for about 2 months. I have the luxury of working on something for 3 months, 6 months. So, I can't think about language and things like that. But I guess, like, for my journalist colleagues who are have to turn things over in, like, 5 days, that's not something that they can always do, especially, like, kind of chase editors and stuff. Like, pieces go out without them even knowing and things like that. But I think, like as Archana was saying, like where we can, we should think about language, and like we should kind of, it's funny, Sadaf walked in, but like there's something that, like once I was writing this piece about biscuits sort of, and he told me something about tutti frutti, which is kind of like a thing that we put on milkshakes and all that. And we don't speak in English. So for me to translate that, because the things he was telling me were really hilarious, but like for me to like put that into English was not possible. But I think that even within English language writing, there should be a tendency to kind of retain the dialect or the rhythm of another language, which we try to do, which again is hard. But like, for example, like with Vittles, like a lot of pieces about South London will sound like South London because they have a specific way of talking. So then I tell my colleagues, like, if someone's writing from Lahore, why can't they sound like Punjabi? Because that's what they're operating in. So we try to do that sometimes. And if we can't publish in two languages, like I think that's really important to like actually just retain rhythm. And I know that, and getting translators on board is really crucial, and translators are severely underpaid, which is something that I think the industry should fix, and then we're good to, they should be paid as much as writers at least, but writers are also underpaid. That's a whole, yeah.
That's for another session. We'll not get into that. That's very sticky ground. We will not. I am sure the audience waiting to ask questions. But before we have 10 minutes, so we're going to take a couple of questions. What I request you is, please introduce yourself. And if it's for a particular speaker, let us know that. And if someone, all of you who have burning questions but couldn't ask in that span of 10 minutes, there's lunch, do hound them. But before we do that, quick round. One word that troubles you in that space.
Flavor. Every food has flavor. So I mean, I don't understand why flavor is used a lot when it comes to South Asian food. So I mean, I'm just picking this because I know we've discussed a bunch of terms, but I let others pick the more common ones that really irritate. But flavor irritates me personally because it's not enough. There are way more words that can be used. And yeah, it's just, so that would be my choice.
Ishita?
Smell becomes, represented through very homogeneous adjectives. There's a bunch of adjectives, and which is used to kind of communicate smell, along which eclipses both flavor and texture.
And texture. Sharanya?
I think mine is like, I know this is, again, I think like the idea of like something like humble beginnings kind of bothers me, especially because oftentimes it's like a woman standing at the stove for about 7 hours, and then it's like humble. It's like there's not, like someone worked for this. So I think that kind of, that bothers me a bit.
So before we open this up, I'm going to, I'll add to that list. For me, it's, refined. It's such a classist word. It just, it just assumes that one food is better than the other. Completely eclipses everything else around it. So I think mine is refined. And with that, we'll open the floor for questions. Oh, let's not go there. Let's not go there. We'll have we'll need a day for that or more. Questions?
Fantastic panel, very related to the kind of challenges I face. My name is Anugyan. I am a film scholar. I write on cinema, and I write on Indian cinema primarily. So obviously, I'm also constantly engaging with this idea of translation. Of course, I also want to produce my scholarship and my research in English because I want it to be read by both diverse South Asian audience and readers as well as the Western audience. But I think we suffer from the burden of over-translation and over-footnoting and over-explaining. I mean, it was okay for a certain maybe period of time because we were entering much later in the discipline with our kind of methodologies and discourse and scholarship and reading, etc. So I understand that we were familiarizing the world with our so-called, nuances and terminologies and specialities, etc. Trying to present our cultural products or expressions as many ways similar, but also so many ways different. So I understand that. But what has happened in the process is that we are always expected to footnote and, explain. Sometimes I want the American man also to sit and Google and do a little bit of research himself or herself. They never explain when they say quesadilla. They never translate quesadilla. It is expected that we would know what a quesadilla is, or something else, from South America, or from something that is Native American, or something that is very, very typically Western European. They expect that we would know. They don't give footnotes. So why is it that we have to give footnotes? But that's not the question. My question is, I want all of you to respond to this idea of what, something that we are facing as a challenge, especially in today's time, where there is a renewed interest in producing anti-colonial, decolonial, indigenous, again, authentic, within quotes, indigenous narrative. So much, especially around food. For instance, Vedic food. It's all pure vegetarian. I mean, how? It's the most bizarre thing that one can think of. So I just wanted you to respond to this idea of, presenting a new anti-colonial, decolonized kind of version, especially around food, and the risk of homogenizing it around a particular kind of language and a particular kind of region, a particular kind of caste, class, and religion. Yeah. Thank you.
All of you would like to respond to that? Yes, please. Shall we take another question and then, in the interest of time? Okay, sure. Yeah, but please keep it to the questions and.
I think when it comes to regional food writing, I know we've been talking about Indian food writing for a Western audience, but I would like to say that for me, it's very interesting to read about, like as an Indian food writing for other regions. So if more regional words are used, it's more like a carrot for me to delve deeper into that culture, into like a chena podo. Like I know what a chena is, but I don't know why it's called a podo, right? So now I'm going to go back and do my research. So while it's okay for our food writing to take, our food to the Western audience, I think it's very important to first bring it to the Indian audiences. And I that's just a comment that, possibly you guys can throw some light on.
Yeah. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that it's like easy for me to sit here and be like, we should do this, we shouldn't do this. And there's been like generations of people that have been working to archive and, bring us to this point. Oh God, I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, this kind of, first the sort of pandering that we have to do oftentimes. Like once I think I got told, they were like, a Sikh kebab roll is like a taco, and I had not eaten a taco, but I eat like a Sikh kebab roll every day, So that kind of thing happens. I might have to pass the mic because I forgot your question. Yeah, sorry. And then I can come back.
Anugyan, thanks for that question, because aside, we were having a conversation that there's suddenly a pressure to factor in these two terms, decolonization and anti-colonization, without paying attention to the processes. One of the, I think one of the brilliant examples of actually decolonizing understanding of rice was to look at the Sindhi region yesterday, one of the paper presenters, right? So if your material is hinting towards that, yes, engage with that discourse, right? But I think, just because there are these very heavily loaded critical scholarship that is coming out, right? If one is talking about Bani Chao, you cannot not talk about decolonization or anti-colonization, right? But, so certain, for Mishti, for instance, there has to be a different lens to look at it, Then if I really want to engage with that, and which I have done in one of the works, I look at the breeds of cow, like everyone is very passionate about, Desi Guru, And, and we had this tussle with the editor, where I said, I do not want to use indigenous because, within the Indian, understanding of tribes, there was a rejection of the term indigenous, It was very much like tribes have to be used. There was a long deliberation. I said, and I don't want to give that clarification because I'm writing it for a academic journal. They can read up, right? Now, they said, let's use the name of the exact breed. Locally, whatever it's used, and you spell it exactly as if phonetically it should come across as, I said, it's Dishi Guru. So as I said, let's stay with Dishi Guru. You also don't translate it as indigenous cow breeds and all of that, because the Dishi Guru is very much a crossbred. That's what, the dairy scientist was saying. Now, one is, that when we think about this decolonizing food ways, it is also about we need to bring in stories of connections and, people, right? And then you can't treat the community as a fixed, static, understanding of community, right? Coming to this thing question, and I absolutely agree with you that, that when it comes to, we often struggle that, with this understanding, particularly in the academic, this thing that I do not want a material on Indian food only to be read by, scholars only from India, right? And I always say this, that don't think that you need to dumb it down because it's an informed audience that you're engaging with, right? How do I end up communicating about my field site where, I neither dumb it down or this thing, but yet there is a sense of that place. That is why I think words become very critical. We never give a very sensorial description of the place without exoticizing it, right? If it smells, if I felt, it smells bad, it may be because of my caste class location. Why am I scared to write about it? Right? This is something, I kind of, feel that our openness about ourselves, I think, could also save us a little bit of this conversation. Then the writer is engaging with the audience. That, I too smelled, I too felt, when I first entered, it was terrible. Yeah.
I'll just quickly respond
Quickly,
to,
because
yeah.
we just have to wrap up.
Yeah. So to the point about this push towards, ancient Vedic food or this kind of like, I won't lie that there is a sort of an increasing sort of, we are getting lots of pitches that are about food that is very vehemently, authentically Indian. There is taking power back, which is important to do, and then there is blatant misinformation, which needs to stop happening. So there's two different types of things that are going on. I'm not saying that we must not look at existing narratives that have been set by, say, in this case, colonization. But in that attempt to do that, you cannot obviously write lies and put together stuff that's not thing. So I think, again, the responsibility is on gatekeepers like us, which you have to ensure that when a pitch comes to us or when a piece of writing is there, where are the sources, what is the research, who is writing it, what are their motivations, and all of that needs to sort of be kept in mind. And yeah, absolutely. Also, at the same time, Indian writing in English, while you are decolonizing, you're also colonizing within India. So you need to be aware of what kind of power you have as a writer and as an editor, and ensure that is kept in check. And awareness really goes a long way in the whole thing. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions because there are more panels to come which are equally interesting. And the good part is that, when we talk about words, it's not just about the written word. There's way more ways in which Indian food's being talked about and documented, which we'll get to talk about in the next coming panel. Sum it up in just one sentence, that's a tall order, is that, I think we are perfectly poised at a place where we can push the boundaries a bit and ask the reader to do a little more work, whether it's an Indian reader reading about more regional food, or it's a reader who's non-Indian or not from the subcontinent trying to understand it. So I think as writers, as editors, let's push that boundary. Let's trust ourselves a little more and the language a little more, that, it'll interest people to look up and read. And we'll do some service, good service to do it. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you so much.